always good to see when prayers get answered and that things come through, especially after as long as what Ken and Karen have been praying about. So Proverbs 22 verse 13. Just this one verse here. It says, "The slothful man saith, there's a lion without, I shall be slain in the streets." And so with that, we'll use this one text as we get into the lesson for tonight. Heavenly Father, Lord, I pray you would just lead and guide. And Lord, I pray you would just address the needs of our hearts. And so thankful, Lord, that you call us and you use us. And I pray that you just really instill this verse really securely in our hearts. Because I believe that we limit ourselves so many times. And Lord, human nature always looks for excuses. But I pray that we'll remove the excuses and, Lord, meet the challenges head on. And, Lord, live for your glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I was reading about George Washington Carver, and I don't know how much you know about him, but he was one of the guys that said 99% of the failures happen because of people making excuses. And he said, if somebody that's going to make excuses for his whole life, he's never going to accomplish anything. And he was one of these guys. And of course, his life really lived up to that ideal. Because if you know anything about George Washington Carver, his life was anything but ideal. He grew up into slavery. His whole life was just tough from the very beginning. His mother and his sister at one time, growing up at the beginning of the Civil War era was when he was born. I think 1864. Around that time frame was when he was born. His mother and his sister was at one time taken by outlaws, and then they were just escorted away out of his life, never to be heard of again, and he never knew what happened to his mother or to his sister. And his dad, he was killed there in an accident. I don't know what happened, but he had the wagon wheels, the wagon trains back in that day. But it was one of those wagon train accidents that his father lost his life, and then I believe his brother, his only brother that he had, he lost his life to, I believe it was smallpox or chickenpox. I forget which one it was, but lost his whole family at a very early age. And everything that he had known growing up, all of that was gone. And for most people, that would crush them. That would destroy them. It knocked their legs out from underneath of them. How could you go on from that? Being raised in slavery and your whole life just overturned, not having any parents, not having any siblings. Where do you go from there? Most people would make excuses, Look at the life that was handed over to me. I don't have the opportunities. I don't have the ideals that most people have. And he could use that for an excuse. If anybody could, it would have been this guy, but he never used that as an excuse. And in fact, I thought it was amazing that, of course, Abraham Lincoln, with Brother Don and I was talking a little bit before the service, and Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, his former master, his slave owner, of course, he's set free now, and he paid for him to go into get an education. So he got an education, and he decided to go out and get a college degree. And of course, he's paying for this out of his own pocket. He's working. He didn't want to take a dime from anybody. He decided, he says, I'm going to work for everything to have. I'm going to own my education. I'm going to work for it so that it's mine. And he didn't let his circumstances define who he was. In the first college that he went to, they turned him down because of his skin color. And then he signed up for, I think it was Iowa State. And he got a degree, a bachelor's degree, and a master's degree in agriculture. And really, it's just an amazing story. You think about George Washington Carver, and he never let the circumstances become an excuse for him to fail or to fall by the wayside. I can't do it because of my circumstances. I can't do it because I don't have any family. I can't do it because of my skin color. I can't do it because of my learning, my education, what have you. None of that came out of his lips. He just continued to thrive and to trust God and to press on where he was at in the situation. In fact, he wrote this after his brother and his his father was killed and his brother died of smallpox, he wrote this: "Being conscious as never before that I was left alone, I trusted God and pushed ahead." And he said, "I'd never allow anyone to give me money, no difference how badly I needed it. I wanted literally to earn my living." And he took ownership of his life, took ownership of his education. And he dedicated his life to teaching the poor African American people where he was, teaching him how to have crops and to raise good crops and to take care of themselves. And that's what he devoted his life to. And of course, down in Alabama, the Tuskegee Institute, he had an integral part in building that. And so he was able to excel past what anybody could ever imagine. Not having the money, not having the resources, not having the best abilities. He really had to work at learning and training himself to do these things. And of course, several other things was dedicated to him or recognized because of his doings. It says his research resulted in the development of hundreds of products made from crops such as peanuts, sweet potatoes. And he did all that despite working with limited resources and opportunities because of segregation. And where others might have offered excuses, Carver achieved excellence. And so when I look here at this Proverbs, there are some people that would just look at life and say, you know what, there's a lion in the street, there is this that's standing in my way, there is something that I'm not willing to do because it's too hard, it's impossible, it's not for me, it's too much. And so they don't even venture trying to do anything else. Why? Because they see it as something that's threatening to them, and so they don't even try. Whereas other people would look at an obstacle like that, and they would say that this is an opportunity to overcome the circumstances, to better myself, to get stronger, to be able to do something more for the glory of God. You know what I'm saying? They're not making excuses for a lion in the street. And by the way, how many lions do you think were in the cities? Not very many. And I realize in Solomon's day it wasn't, as developed, but you look at everything that Solomon did. He had great building programs and everything else that was going on during his time. And so Solomon didn't coddle them. He didn't try to say, you know what, that's going to be okay. I know you're afraid. It's okay for you to be lazy. It's okay for you to not try anything. It's okay for you to just sit back and take a welfare check or something like that. That was never his attitude. In fact, he would warn, he would rebuke people who had that mentality. He threw the proverbial glass water in his face. You get somebody that's, I just remember this growing up. Not that it happened to me, but people who were lazy. You find them laying in their bed and they didn't want to get up. What do? You take that cold water and you dump it on them. So get up out of bed. And that's kind of what Solomon is doing. To try to shock them, to get their attention, to say, you're not going to stay in this state in this way. To get them activated and moving and doing something. And how you face difficulty in life will determine where you go. You'll either lay down and give up, or you'll rise to the occasion and face the challenges. And so we must see challenges not as obstacles, that's going to defeat us, but as opportunities to do something to better our families, to better ourselves, to better our church, to better our communities, to better, but not to be defeated. It's like somebody that a hurricane comes and a tornado tears down their house. What do you want to do? Say it's useless? You go back out and you build again. And you face the difficulties. You accept it with ownership and you build it. Why? Because your family needs that shelter. You need that shelter. And it's important. So see these three things here, the excuses and then the excelling, and then there's the exceptional person that we'll find here. So the excuses, danger from the devil. Lazy people have always had excuses, and that's an understatement, I believe. I remember early on just going to school, it was always like The Simpsons on the TV saying the dog ate my homework. that's why I didn't do it, and it's just a lousy excuse. No matter what, people always have these excuses why they can't do something. They see the difficulties and reasons why they can't do something. They reject any good explanations, saying, you know what, if you really wanted to better yourself, you can get a job. You can take care of your family. You can go out and make something of yourself. You can learn how to use your hands. You can build something. You can cook if you want to. I remember when my mother had cancer and she told us, my sister and myself, she says, I may die. And she says, I want you to learn how to take care of yourselves. You will learn how to fold laundry and do laundry. You will learn how to cook. You will learn how to take care of yourself in case something happens to me. And I appreciate that bold thing that was thrown in my face to make me grow up, because as a young kid, can I tell you, there was a lazy streak in me here and there. And it caused me to grow up really quick. There's people that they're always afraid of something. And even when somebody gives them the motivation to do something, they even turn that down because they got an excuse for even that. And they see the impossible, and so they're not even willing to try. They say it's just too much. And you guys met people like that, and I've met people like that over and over and over again. There have been times where I've had my pity parties. And there's times where I've come up with every reason why I can't do something. It's just tougher for me. People have the better ability to know how to memorize Scripture better than I can. They seem to be able to memorize pages off of a book, whereas me, I have to really study and try and work at it. There's other people that are just better looking, smarter, they're stronger, they have other abilities, but that's never an excuse to say, well, forget it, I'm not even going to try. And so I'm sure we've all done the same things here and there. Challenges are difficult for a reason. They'll either stop you or they'll cause you to succeed and get stronger, right? Weak people, they never try anything. And it's true. Weak people say, it's not my fault, I'm just a victim. Weak people are always blaming somebody else for what they're doing and what they're going through. It's never a good thing to make excuses in life. And it ought never be our philosophy. They're convinced themselves of the impossibility, and so they say, why try? Laziness refuses to try. And you know what? Laziness is a character problem. It's formed by bad habits. It's formed by a lack of discipline. And it lends itself to moral failure. There's a lot of people like this. They say, I just struggle with this temptation in my life. And it's just something I've dealt with all my life, and I'll never be able to defeat it, and I'll never be able to overcome this temptation in my life. And they just lay down and just let that thing have the control over them, whether it's laziness or something else. And so they'll just lay down and never do anything about it, instead of determining by the grace of God, saying, I will beat this thing in my life. And I'm not going to let it destroy me, and I'm not going to let it destroy my family, and I'm not going to let it destroy my church, and I'm not going to let it destroy anything. But there's other people that give up. Even before sin entered into the world, God intended Adam to be what? A worker, a keeper of the garden, to tend it and to keep it. Which means you got to constantly be out there. Why? Because weeds grow up every single day. And there's always rabbits out there or some insect that's out there, something out there trying to destroy the crops, and you got to be diligent. Adam didn't get up one day and say, you know what, God, I'm not going to go to work. And of course, God gave him that seventh day to rest, and of course it's commanded in Scripture. But he told him you need to dress it, and you need to keep it, and you need to watch it, and you need to be vigilant. Proverbs 15:19, the way of the slothful man is a hedge of thorns. Where do thorns come from? The curse, right? There's some people that watch and they'll see the thorns and thistles grow up everywhere, the fences decaying, the stone walls breaking down, and their families being torn apart, and they don't do anything, they don't even lift a finger to do anything about it. But we need to be continually vigilant in these circumstances. Why? Because if you don't do anything about the one thorn popping up, how many more is going to come behind it? You don't do anything about the weeds, how many more is going to come behind it? You don't do anything about the one crack in the wall, next thing you know, like my grandmother's barn, the whole foundation will be separated. And you'll constantly be confronted with those obstacles in your life until you do something about what's causing it to break and to bring it together. So it causes us to do something about these obstacles in our life, and they'll hinder any progress in life, so we need to do something about it. So it should be an incentive to do something. It's not just laziness that's the problem, but here's the other thing, is foolishness, right? Foolishness in the mind. We know from a very early stage on up, it says foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. And a child, you got to discipline them, you got to work at it, you got to continually work to train them and to teach them and to raise them for the glory of God. I've just been really confronted with that truth. It's even in this chapter, in verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. And really, it's a warning, because if you just let your children go, guess what's going to happen? They're going to depart. And they're going to go out into the world, and they're going to be a wreck, not being able to face life. And so we need to deal with the foolishness that's in our thinking to keep us from doing anything. And it's foolish. There's some things that just come into the mind. It just keeps us to say, I'm not able, and that's all you think about, and that's all you concentrate on is your inability. You may not have the ability, but you can work at it. You can do something about it. And these guys, they reject sound reasoning. Proverbs 26, verse 16, the sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. He refuses to labor. Proverbs 21:25, the desire of the slothful killeth him, for his hands refuse to labor. It didn't say that he couldn't, it just says he refuses to labor. And then Paul, didn't he confront that over in 2 Thessalonians? He said, there's some of you, you're busybodies. You're out there in other people's matters, and you're not even lifting your finger to work or do anything. And so you saw how we handled ourselves when we came into town. We worked with our own hands. We shown you how you ought to behave. We never taught you to sit back and be lazy, even though that we know that the second coming of Christ is on its way. You need to be active. You need to be busy and learn to have that quiet spirit, but be active and do something in life. In fact, this is what he says. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat, for we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such we command and exhort by our Lord Jesus Christ, and with quietness they work and eat their own bread. And then we find Proverbs 26:14, as the door turneth upon his hinges, so that the slothful upon his bed, this way and that way, this way and that way. Uneasy, his body hurts. His mind is constantly thinking. He knows the day's coming. He's got to feed himself. And what then? But he's constantly turning and never does anything. He never has a peace of mind. And someone like that must correct his thinking. Again, think about the lions back in that day. Lions are in the wilderness for a reason. That's where all of his food supply is. And he's out there and he's looking for, this little antelope or whatever they are, on the Discovery Channel or whatever it is. And they're out there and they're chasing. They're looking for the weak and they're looking for the prey, the small ones, to go after and to chase and to hurt them and then devour them. And they go after them, and so they have their food source. It's out in the wilderness, and also the habitation's out in the wilderness. In other words, there was no reason for them to come into town unless it was because they had a lack of food supply, or they just got lost along the way, something like that. But they normally were not out into the streets. And so for somebody to say, well, there's a lion in the streets, they knew that there were lions outside the walls. I believe they probably heard the roaring of the lions from time to time, and they could hear it going on out there. But how many people would go into work day in and day out? Solomon was continually outside of his palace, doing gardening, building buildings, diplomacy. People came and went all the time. How many of them do you think were devoured by lions? I dare venture very, very, very few. Be like the statistics. Everybody's wondering, what's the statistics of people who are killed by lions or bears or natural disasters or car crashes or sharks or something like that, And can I tell you this? It would be very, very few. We don't have that in our, even in our, well, of course, it's not in North America. I understand that. We do have some out and foolish people out in the zoos who do sometimes get hurt, but that's their own foolishness. But anyway, I dare say there's not very many of them. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But people get killed in airplane crashes all the time. They get killed in car crashes all the time. People die from various different causes, and that doesn't cause them to stay inside, indoors, and say, you know what, I'm just not going to work today. I'm not going to do anything today. And so we got to be careful, because that thinking keeps them from doing anything, and it's a false thinking. It's a thinking of their imagination. Their imaginations are ruling them. It's one of these things that I wish we would have had during COVID, and I would have found this verse and I would have put it up there, because you know what? In 2020, COVID was that lion that says, you know what? I'm not coming back to church. You know what? I'm not going to leave my house. And then we have all these problems that we have today. But that was the lion that was in the room during that time. And he says, I'm not going to let this control my life from doing what I need to do. And so we got to confront that line of thinking. The lion kept people from doing the right thing. And deep down inside, the sluggard must have known that his chances of being killed by the lion were slim. Excuses come from physical laziness. That's an undisciplined life. It says, I'll just get up when I want to. I'll just work when I want to. It's an undisciplined life. They don't eat right. They don't sleep right. They don't have any discipline in their lives. And then excuses from foolishness. It's an undisciplined mind. It doesn't think things through scripturally, biblically. They're not really thinking right in their mind. They have an undisciplined mind. They're controlled by things that are far from being real or true, but yet it rules their minds. It keeps them from living a sane life. So there's the undisciplined life, the undisciplined mind, and then the undisciplined heart that lets their emotions run wild because of the fear. And again, it's this imaginary lion that haunted him. Why? Because in his mind, he thinks he's constantly being hunted everywhere that he goes. And this fear controlled him so that he wouldn't do anything in this world. What the mind concentrates on moves the heart. The way I break it down is this. You see a child and he's running toward the road, and you see a car that's coming this way. What are you going to do? You're going to run to grab that child, and if need be, you'll even put your own life in front of that child to save that child. If it's a train, or if it's just a vehicle, or if it's a bear, or if it's a dog or something like that, and you will sacrifice your life, everything you can, to face that danger. Why? Because you're thinking about the welfare of that child. Well, that fear doesn't stop a mother from saving her child. It doesn't stop a father from sacrificing himself for his family. The fear doesn't matter. Why? Because of what's at stake. And so, what causes this person to react and face those fears and do something about it, as opposed to this other person who has this imaginary fear that controls him so that he can't do anything. He's paralyzed. The thing about it is, it's just he lets his imagination control him. And it's not a reality. His emotions and his feelings and his thoughts control him. But it's not the reality. But the person on the other end of it, the parent, sees the reality for what it is, and it faces the fear. So the one hand, you see the reality acts out, and the person who's living in, what do you say, an ultra universe, or a different reality. It's not a reality. And there's a lot of people that are living today, they're not living in reality. They're not able to face life for what it is. It's dangerous to live in an alternative reality. But that's exactly what man is doing. Matthew Henry said this. I like this. He says, he considers not as real danger from the devil that roaring lion which is in bed with him, and from his own slothfulness which kills him. In other words, he says, the real lion, the roaring lion, it's the devil that's keeping you in bed, and it's the devil that's keeping you in bed that's going to kill you. And you don't realize it. That's what Matthew Henry says. And this quality affects the whole man's life. You know, you think about the career. Somebody that's been working for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden stops, and you say, well, what's going on? Well, my fears, you know, the stock market crash or something like that. And so I'm not going to do anything because my whole life has crumbled out from underneath of you. Well, you don't stop. You got to keep building. Or the other person, you know, it says, well, you know, straight out of high school, say, well, I don't know what I want to do in my life. And they never end up doing anything because they do here, and they're just all over the place, and they never accomplish anything, and they never progress. Why? Because they don't dedicate themselves. And then there's this other person that's lazy, and they never progress in life. What about marriage? I learned this just in my short years of being married. Marriage takes work, doesn't it? You say, my marriage fell apart. I don't know how it happened. No, I know how it happened. You neglected your wife. You neglected your children. You neglected your home. That's how it happened. You didn't work at it. You didn't show the proper love to your wife or to your children or what have you. I don't know what it is, but it was an undisciplined marriage. It was an undisciplined home. It was an undisciplined life. You see, it's the undisciplined life, the undisciplined mind, the undisciplined heart that destroys them, and everything comes crashing down. They never take ownership for their own actions. Instead of taking ownership, they say, well, you know what? It's so-and-so's fault. It's the system's fault. It's the government's fault. It's this person's fault. Instead of saying, you know what? It's my fault, and I can't change it. Never build a life on excuses. Why? Because it'll kill your spiritual life. Because you'll just continually live in carnality. You say, well, Pastor, you know what? I had a rough life. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I didn't have all the privileges. I didn't have all the right advantages. I didn't have any of these things. And, you know, I'm just weak-minded, and that's just the way it is. And the temptations are just too strong, and it's just this, and it's just that. Those are all excuses. Just all excuses. What happened in the Garden of Eden? Eve took of the fruit, didn't she? Listened to the lies of the devil. Adam partook knowing full well what the consequences was. When God came looking for Adam, Adam, where art thou? What did he do? He made an excuse. It's the wife that thou gavest me. It's the wife you gave me. What did Moses up on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, and Aaron, his brothers down at the bottom, of course the children of Israel said, we don't know what happened to Moses. Why don't you make us a god and we'll follow him? Aaron says, give me all your earrings, and he cast it into the fire. And Moses comes and confronts him with it, and what does he say? I don't know what happened. I just threw it in there, and it came out like this. That's a lousy excuse. Saul, when Samuel comes up to him, what meaneth the bleating of the sheep? And what is it? It's the people. They made me do it. Samuel, you know me. I'll always do the right thing, but it was the people. It didn't stand very far with God, did it? So this day your kingdom's going to be departed from you. We've got to stop being controlled by our excuses and do something about it. And then the excellence, rising to the occasion. Found this article, it says, letgodbetrue.com. I found this article on there, but it says this, challenges are opportunities. They mean the lazy will not be competing, and so there's more for you. They mean that the wages for profit will be more. They mean the honor for finishing will be higher. They mean the skill and experience acquired will be greater. In other words, he's saying this, there's a lot of lazy people that will never do anything that gives you more opportunity to better yourself. Why? Because you're willing to face the difficulties and the challenges. So when the going gets tough, the tough must get going. But say, I know it's tough, but there's something to do. These words didn't originate with the lazy man, they originated with the diligence. Failure. Failure is when you fail and you fail to get back up. Everybody fails. And when you fail, you don't stay down, you get back up. The just man falleth 7 times, but he rises back up again. Failure is inevitable. It's just going to happen. As long as sin's in this world, there's going to be failures, but you got to get back up again. Learn this when you begin to walk. You know, watching my boys as they learn to walk, they're going to stumble, they're going to hit their head, they're going to fall, they're going to get bumps, when they get scraped, especially when they're trying to run and they run kind of crazy, right? And they run on the wrong side of the sidewalk over here and they fall and they hit that concrete and they get scrapes on their knees and stuff like that. And you say, well, that's part of life, kid. You back up, we'll put a Band-Aid on it, you're all right. Your bones are not broken, you're going to be okay. I remember when I first started riding a bike, and of course I was one of these crazy kids. I didn't want to start with a small little bike. I went from the tricycle, and I saw my sister, my oldest sister, Sherry, and she had this 18-speed bicycle. You know, it had all the gears and stuff, and I thought to myself, that's what I want to ride. I could barely get on that thing. I just barely got my legs over top of the little bars that were just crossing down below. And I just jump on there. I couldn't even get up to the seat. And I'm like, I want to ride this thing. And I remember falling over so many times. But I'm like, I'm not going to stop. I want to ride it. My sister can ride it. I can ride it too. You know, I just wasn't going to be defeated. I wasn't going to stop. And that was the kind of mentality that I had. I'm like, if I want to ride a bike, I'm going to go straight for it. I don't care how many cuts and bumps and bruises I get. But there's a lot of people that have stopped. Life's full of challenges, but you never accomplish anything if you never try. I'll put down a few notes here about my first sermon that I ever preached. And I was telling Sarah about it. And I said, you know what? My first sermon that I ever preached, I preached at a Southern Baptist church, and I remember the outline. And Jesus wept over the world. And Jesus wept over Jerusalem. And Jesus wept over the tomb of Lazarus. Still remember the outline to this day. I might even use it again, except for Sarah says, you know, honey, it never really actually says that Jesus wept over the world. And I said, well, it says in John 3:16, for God so loved the world, shouldn't He weep when He knows that many are perishing? You know, in my mind it made sense, right? It was just the most exciting thing. I was so nervous. I remember my first suit and first sermon, and I was letting it all. I was giving it the best I knew how, and I was just relating the message. Never trained, never had any support, but I knew God called me to preach, and I was going to preach it to the best of my ability. And I was excited about it. And of course, I got a few criticisms here and there, but that's all right. I was happy. First time going soul winning. Just out there knocking. I was like, I never heard of this done before, much less seen it done. And out there knocking on doors, I'm like, this is scary. It really rattled my nerves. I'm like, you literally go up to people's houses and knock on their doors? It's like, yeah, this is how you do it. And I'm like, wow. I'm probably not going to last very long. I know it's a school requirement, but I'm not. This is just not me and who I am. And after a while, I got used to doing it, but it was an obstacle to overcome. And I remember one guy that I got to lead to the Lord, and it really stunned me. It was just like going down the Romans Road and all of this, and so, would you like to get saved? And he says, yes, this is what I want to do. And I was able to lead him to the Lord, and then he gave me a great big hug, and it just shook me because I never thought that I'd be able to do something like that. Remember the first time I was, Sarah and I, we was leaving ambassador, and I was getting ready to see where God would have us to go. We're straight out of Bible college. And in one church, I was talking to the pastor. He had me come, and he was very gracious and very good to me. And I was preaching my sermon there, Acts chapter 2, I believe it was, getting back to the basics. And I was convinced that the sermon wasn't very good, but I was doing the best I could with what I knew how. I concluded that message. I remember the pastor, he was sitting right over here on this side of the auditorium, and he kept looking at me, and he was like, I'm like, oh man, I've been too long. I was like, all right. So I just closed it the best I could, and then I saw this guy coming down the aisle. I was asking if anybody wanted to get saved. Now's the time. And he come down the aisle, and I thought to myself, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. It just really confirmed it for me. Now, we didn't end up going to that church, but, it was just something that really hit home to me. It helped me out. There was a lot of firsts that I had to do. The first funeral. Remember Mongoose and seeing him there at the funeral home, and he was yellow as could be. His sister took him over to the hospital in Durham. I remember just going to the hospital. I'm like, I've never been in this situation before. This pastor, my brother, he's got stage 4 cancer, and they don't know how much longer he's going to have, and it's probably not going to make it more than a month or two. And he didn't last but 3 weeks. And I'm there at the hospital watching him change this naked man, and just, it's just real rough. And I've never seen anybody like that in that kind of state. And he couldn't even do anything for himself. And it really tore me up. And I watched him when they brought him over into the hospice care place, and just working with him and telling him the scriptures and repeating the scriptures and telling him how he could be saved and how he could have assurance of salvation, and trying to see if he understands it. And he's finally he had that assurance before he passed away, and he said, God has a mansion for me, and I'm ready. And it just really worked me over, though, because it was my very first funeral that I had to oversee. And that was rough. But it was good for me. It was good for me. What obstacles are we faced with? Your mind needs to stop thinking of all the reasons why we can't, but it must think of what will accomplish the will of God. And if you don't think in faith, you'll never act in faith. It's like I saw the quote Miss Dottie put up, and she said, Mr. Hankey, faith is a choice, not a feeling. Faith is a choice, not a feeling. The same thing applies here. If you don't think in faith, if you don't believe what God says, you'll never act in faith. You'll never do anything in faith. What obstacles are you faced with? Your heart racing, your mind racing, your emotions raging. And God tells us over, and I think it's 2 Timothy 1:7, God's not giving you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind. That's what God will do for you. David saw a giant, and he saw everybody making excuses. They were cowering. They were in fear of their life, and they looked at this giant, and they were not doing anything about it. Why? Because it was an obstacle. This man was a man of war from his youth on up. He was head and shoulders above the rest. Nobody in Israel during that point in time in their life were willing to face the giant. They had no faith whatsoever until David comes along, and he looks at this giant, this wee little shepherd boy. He doesn't have very much he doesn't have any warfare underneath of his belt, other than the fact that he saved his father's flock from a time or two, from the bear and from the lion. And he looks at this Philistine, and he says, is there not a cause, as he defies the army, the God of Israel? And he says, there's a cause. And he says, I'll face him. I'll face him. And David was one man who says, I'm not going to make excuses for my size. I'm not going to make excuses for my military abilities. but I know that God is able. That's the kind of mentality that we need. Excuses will ruin you, but excellence will be revealed in you. And we see the exemplary. You guys, many of you have been in basic training, so some of you know what I'm talking about. Particularly, you guys have been in the infantry, which I believe it might only be Brother Adams, right? You're the only one that was in the infantry, right? So, okay. I remember, thinking to myself, man, basic training, this is going to be rough. I remember the guys just laughing in the drill sergeant's face on the first day, and they got straightened out real quick. And those few obstacle courses I remember seeing these telephone poles laid up in logs, and they're like, you got to go under and over and under and over. And then you got to go here, and you got to crawl underneath this barbed wire, and you got to do this, and you got to do that. And I said, has anybody ever completed this thing alive? And it was difficult. When I get through that, and I'm like, there's one course under my belt. I got it. And then the infiltration course where the live fire is going over top of your head. I'm like, how many, in my mind thinking, how many people got killed doing this? And just bullets firing and C4 going off on all sides of you, sand blowing up in the air and landing on top of you. And you're like, man, they're not playing around. And getting to the other side, and I'm like, wow, I lived. The FTX course, they tell you, you're going to march 25 miles.